Did you know that when it comes to EU expansion, the majority of pain points arise from the fact that Europe is treated as one country? Are you also thinking of expanding to Europe? If so, you are in the right place. Here we have a few tips today from Flexport experts across go-to-market strategy, logistics, trade policy, and customs to give you a quick primer. My name is Indre, and I am the General Manager of the Benelux region in Europe, which is Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Before we begin, we'd love to invite everyone to submit their questions in the Q&A window to the right of your screen. If we can't get to all of them, a Flexport expert will respond directly. Now with me today is Chris Rogers, the Principal Supply Chain Economist at Flexport with 25 years of trade policy and supply chain expertise. He'll be giving you the macro view of what to expect when expanding into Europe. We also have Tom Gould, Flexport VP of Global Customs, another 25-year industry veteran. Tom will guide us through the customs considerations that you need to know. Next up is the legal disclaimer. Make sure you give it a quick glance. And now I'll pass it on to Chris, our economist, who will give you a quick overview of the opportunity in Europe.
Thanks, Indre, and thank you everybody for joining us today. There's been plenty of focus on the negatives in Europe. We've been facing Brexit, a shortage of natural gas, political uncertainty in Germany, worsening relations with the US, and of course, logistics problems. Yet most of these are short-term in nature, and the data shows that Europe's trade economy has recovered to levels that are better than pre-pandemic levels. A couple of numbers to conjure with. Foreign direct investment from the US into Europe has reached $192 billion in the 12 months to June 30th. And that compares to a net withdrawal in 2019, an investment of just $6 billion in 2018. So we're seeing a lot of new businesses, particularly e-commerce businesses, coming into Europe from the United States. Activity is also increasing. Merchandise trade activity within the EU climbed by just over a fifth in the 3 months to July 31st versus the same period of 2019, while imports from outside the EU and the UK increased by 7%. So activity is back above pandemic levels, investments being made in Europe. It looks like international business is excited about opening up in Europe. I'm going to pass back to Indre to talk a little bit about the how of entering Europe.
Of course. Thanks so much. Now, when it comes to your go-to-market strategy, make sure you start in the right European market for you and your business. Europe is not just one country. It's a continent with 50 countries speaking 24 languages and operating 26 currencies. This means that it will be hard to conquer Europe with just one single go-to-market strategy. To be successful, you need to pick the landing spot which is perfect for your company and your product and establish yourself there. From there, it will be a lot easier to enter other European markets with similar or quite different go-to-market strategies. We see a lot of our customers, especially direct-to-consumer and apparel brands actually, choosing the UK as a natural landing spot due to similar consumer preferences and the same language, English. From there, they usually expand their reach and target other bigger European markets such as France and Germany. So what are some of the best practices that we can share from working with our customers on EU expansion? There's actually 4 things that I always recommend for someone. First, as I mentioned, pick your landing country and pick one. Then identify trusted experts that you want to work with and localize your communication and the product for this market. Even if the language is English, you may want to tweak around the wording or how you position your message. And once you have a good footing, expand to other markets. Well, now that we've covered the go-to-market tips, let's move on to discuss logistics, which is obviously an integral part of any business strategy. When you start thinking about European expansion, make sure to consider your starting setup in Europe holistically and with your long-term strategy in mind. And what I mean by that, don't just do it based on one factor, such as tax. And make sure to incorporate logistics into that setup. So let's take the same example that I mentioned before. for direct-to-consumer companies who choose UK as their first point of expansion because of natural language and consumer preferences, it's usually a great strategy and they're quite successful. However, one pitfall is to not think about where you will expand next and what you want your e-commerce footprint to look like from day one or in a few years' time. Now, you may think, why is this important? Well, because you want to make sure that you pick a location for your distribution center longer term. So, for example, you may want to kick off your expansion in the UK with physical presence, but you would like an e-commerce setup that caters to the whole European Union. In this case, it's usually advised to set up your distribution in the Netherlands, as there are many great facilities that cater to EU-wide e-commerce setups. Thinking this through at the very beginning will ensure that you avoid costly fees to do a new setup 12 or 18 months after you've started, or avoid unnecessary intra-European cargo moves. And in turn, this may also have an impact on how you incorporate and how you present your presence in the UK. Well, I know this may sound a bit complicated and you may be rethinking expanding into Europe altogether, but don't. There are a lot of institutions here to help you. So what do you do first? Well, first we suggest to just start networking and connecting with companies in the US who have attempted EU expansion. Then surround yourself with a panel of experts that can advise you on legal matters, tax, incentives, labor law, immigration, data privacy, and logistics. Once you have narrowed down your initial landing countries to one or two, then you should reach out to foreign direct investment agencies that are located in every country to plan your first expansion step. Here on the slide, you can see the names of agencies in the UK, Netherlands, and Germany. These agencies, in turn, will help you navigate the government setup requirements in those countries. Usually, their advice is not very expensive as they're incentivized to bring foreign direct investment to their country. And in addition to that, you will need to pick a logistics expert with regional expertise. That's why Flexport offers the Certified Partner Network with experts in local markets, all using the Flexport platform who can help you navigate each country's specificity. Well, now that we've covered the go-to-market and logistics tips, I will now pass the microphone to Tom, our customs expert, who will talk about the regulatory nuts and bolts.
Great. Thank you, Indre. Appreciate that. So as Indre was talking about, there are a number of considerations that you need to consider from a customs and regulatory perspective as you are looking to enter a new market. The first consideration that most companies realize that they need to consider is business establishment. So you've decided which country you're going to enter into first, or maybe you've put together a plan of your first country, your second country, and so forth. The next question is, what are you going to do in the way of establishing actually a business presence? You may decide that you want to establish a business presence in Europe. You may decide that you want to establish a business presence in more than one country. Post-Brexit, a lot of companies are realizing that there are benefits to having a company in one of the EU countries and then also having a company in the UK. But other companies look to not actually set up a business entity, a legal business entity in any of the European countries. If that is the case, it may be difficult to find a customs broker that is willing to represent you. When a company is a foreign company to the country of import, they can utilize the services of a customs broker in what's referred to as indirect representation. But not all customs brokers offer that, and not all customs brokers offer that in every single country. The next big issue, and one that often gets missed by US companies, is VAT, or value-added tax. Most countries around the world outside of the United States have some type of a value-added tax regime where they're collecting tax on their products at the time of import. And the value-added taxes are a pass-through tax, which means that those can be, that they're paid at import by importers, and then they can be recovered at the time the products are sold in country, or at the time that the products are exported from the importing country to another country. And it's critically important to ensure that your VAT tax strategy is set up properly. And if you don't, you face the possibility of penalties, but you also face the possibility of not being able to recover the VAT that was paid at the time of import when you're actually selling the products. The third top issue for companies that are looking to enter the European market or any other foreign market is your general customs formalities and those obligations as an importer. And so if you take a look at the import obligations that you might be used to in the United States, when you start looking at importing into other countries, you have a similar set of obligations, but each one is a little bit different. So the first obligation with importing is the HTS classification, is actually knowing which HTS classification number to use. Now, the H in HTS stands for harmonized, which means that the numbers are harmonized from country to country. But the harmonization is only at the first 6-digit level of the 10-digit HTS number. So if you are used to classifying your products in the US, you can potentially use the first 6 digits of your US classification number, but you're going to have to figure out the last 4 digits for the country that you're going to be importing into. And post-Brexit, the UK now has a separate harmonized tariff schedule than the EU. So all the EU countries use a common schedule and the numbers will be the same, but the numbers can be different in the UK or other countries that are not in the EU. In addition to the last 4 digits, you have interpretation. Different countries will interpret the classifications slightly different. For example, what features the US Customs deems are not appropriate for a t-shirt might not be the same as those features that are looked at by the UK Customs or one of the EU Customs authorities. And so the US might classify something as a t-shirt and the EU might classify it as a pullover, different classification number. And that is just based on the different nuances of the product and the interpretations by the different government agencies. The next critical customs issue that you need to consider is valuation. Valuation, again, is harmonized, but what that means is that each of the countries follow the same or fairly similar rules in determining the value of the products. But when you're importing products into another country, all of a sudden your perspective changes, and that might change the valuation that you have to report to the government. One of the first things that companies get as a surprise is that most countries other than the US use the CIF value when importing into the country for determining the duty. In the US, US Customs calculates duty based on the FOB value. So there's slight differences in the EU and the UK and so forth. You're actually paying duty on the cost of freight, international freight and insurance, whereas in the US, you're not paying duty on the cost of international freight and insurance. And there are other slight differences that you need to consider. For example, if your products are designed in the US, there may be a requirement to add a factor to your valuation to cover the cost of the design fees that are done outside the country of import. You also have issues like transfer pricing. So if you set up a company in the EU or you set up a company in the UK and you're moving merchandise from your US company to your new company in the EU, for example, there may be some transfer pricing issues that need to be taken into consideration when looking at the customs value that you're determining. And these strategies with value or the valuation issue actually opens up strategies. In some cases, you might be required to increase the value to meet the local country rules. But in other cases, you might be able to actually decrease the value by a little bit and still meet the country rules for the country of import. The next key area to consider for customs is country of origin. So the country of origin rules are not the same from country to country. It's one area that the World Trade Organization, World Customs Organization has not yet harmonized. And so each country has a different set of rules for determining the country of origin of products, especially products that are made in more than one country. And in addition to the actual rules for determining what origin is declared at the time of import and what origin is placed on your labels, there's also different country of origin rules for different free trade agreements. And one of the things to be aware of is that if you're importing into new countries, each country has free trade agreements and other programs that allow for reduced duty payments or actually the elimination of duty with different countries. In the US, we're familiar with NAFTA, which is now USMCA. But in Europe, there are free trade agreements with many countries, with Canada, with Mexico, with a number of Asian countries. And in order to take advantage of those free trade agreements and duty-free programs, you need to understand the rules of origin under that particular free trade agreement between those countries. Then a next consideration is import licenses and the different countries. Each different country has different licenses. Maybe the licenses are required by the customs authorities, or they may be required by other government agencies in order to import various different products. So it's very important to understand those import license requirements. Your shipments could be held up if you don't have the proper licenses at the time you're looking to import the products. And then the final consideration is document retention. One of the things that all customs agencies have as a common requirement is that there is a requirement to maintain records of import and export transactions for a period of time. Generally, it's around 5 to 7 years, but it varies from country to country. And those obligations are slightly different in different countries. Some countries allow the records to be maintained in other countries. Most countries require the records to be maintained in country. That way, that country's customs authority has the ability to have access to those records. And it may be that your customs broker can provide that local record keeping for you, or there may be a system that you can use that will allow you to meet those record keeping requirements for the country where you're importing your products into. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Chris to talk to us a little bit more about trade policy.
Great, thanks, Tom. So you set your business up, you've picked your landing country and chosen your partners as Indre's advised. You've got your paperwork sorted out and noted all the differences as Tom's been talking about. So you're good to go, right? Well, sadly not. A lot of what you face when you're coming into Europe, or indeed any new market, is driven by trade policy. And trade policy changes all the time. So one of the issues that we've been facing in Europe recently is Brexit. And we've done a separate webinar on all of that. But there's still a lot of questions around relations in Northern Ireland, the way services work, and there's still very much an air of brinkmanship between the UK and the EU, and that's going to drag on to 2022. EU relations with the US are improving. Currently, there's a number of tariffs on trade in consumer goods coming from the US to Europe, and that's linked up to a whole bunch of issues in aerospace and steel and aluminum and so on. Hopefully those will go away. And EU relations with China, obviously if you're setting up a consumer goods company, there's going to be a lot of your stuff will come from China or elsewhere in Asia. They're worsening at the moment. And that's unlikely right now to spill over into trade policy, but it could at really any time. And we've seen these things be very dynamic. So even once you're set up, you're going to have to maintain a very close eye on trade policy. One of the policies that's quite new that I think people coming to Europe need to think about is the EU's environmental policy. There's been a significant new package called Fit for 55. The aim there is to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 55% in 2030 versus 1990, and to cut to being carbon neutral by 2050. Now, the package has 4 elements that you need to be aware of, whatever supply chain you're involved in. Firstly, the shipping industry is going to be included in the Emissions Permit Trading Scheme, or ETS, for the first time. If you're shipping long haul from Asia to Europe, as many consumer goods companies do, that could lead to some significant additional costs. Secondly, there's some changes coming to low carbon fuel supply rules for aviation and also for maritime shipping. That may, again, have an impact on your costs to ship. There's increased renewable energy and energy efficiency targets. Those will have an impact if you're operating warehousing or if you're opening retail stores. There'll be an impact there on your cost of doing business. The fourth one, which is the big one, and unfortunately the really complicated one, and even more unfortunately, the one where not all of the complications or rules have been set yet, is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM. That's designed to reduce carbon leakage, where supply chains might be reoriented away from the EU to avoid higher carbon costs. In practice, it'll probably work rather like an additional tariff on imports from countries that have CO2 emission schemes that aren't as ambitious as the EU's, or where carbon pricing levels are lower. Now, what are the potential impacts of that, and what are the mitigating actions that you can consider? Well, the first thing is the CBAM will initially focus on heavy industry, so steel, refined hydrocarbons, organic chemicals, building materials, and it will be phased in over time. However, it is likely that it will be expanded, and it will include downstream products. So if you're using, for example, any fibers that are based on organic chemicals, if you're using any metals within your products, you're likely to face a CBAM bill at some stage. The CBAM implementation, as I mentioned, hasn't yet been fixed, but it will be based on a requirement to submit import permits, and the processing could well be similar to that used for the EU carbon emission trading scheme. And there'll be effectively rules of origin to declare that. If you want to reduce your CBAM costs by way of your existing carbon reduction techniques, you could do that. But you do need to increase your supply chain visibility fully to make sure you know where your costs are going to come from. There'll obviously be higher costs, as I mentioned already, including from shipping. That may involve some burden sharing potentially between suppliers and buyers. So talk to your suppliers about how they want to share those costs. And again, you may want to use carbon offsets as part of your CBAM certification. A lot of consumer companies are doing that anyway as part of their broader mission to reduce their environmental footprint. And you can speak to our colleagues at flexport.org if you want to discuss those in more detail. Third, a consideration of what regions to operate in will need to include relative carbon pricing. So, for example, China has a national carbon pricing scheme now, but the average carbon price there is only around 10% of that in the European Union. Onshoring to the EU is, of course, an option, particularly given all the other issues that have been going on recently. However, carbon pricing is just one of many costs and considerations that you have to put into that decision. Now, finally, there's also the potential for other countries, particularly small countries with a high exposure to the EU, to adopt the EU's climate policies. We've already seen something similar with the GDPR privacy regulations, and anybody who's been running an e-commerce business knows all about those. So whether you enter Europe or not, you're still going to have to get comfortable with the EU's climate policies. So on trade policy broadly, keep your eyes open, stuff changes quickly, and be particularly aware of environmental issues. We'll wrap it up there. I want to thank you all for listening, and obviously to Indre and Tom, thank you for your comments today. We hope you've learned something useful and new as you embark on your expansion into Europe, and good luck with that. Now, if you want to learn more about the state of ocean and air freight markets, stay with us for the next sessions. We're going to be having speakers from Vespucci Maritime, Atlas Air, Western Digital, and of course, all our expert colleagues from across Flexport. So thanks very much for listening.